Hi, I'm Laura Flanders, and this is The Laura Flanders Show, the TV and radio program that seeks to raise radical spirits by interviewing forward-thinking people with real models of shifting power from the worlds of arts, entrepreneurship, and activism. This week, organizing in a Trump and Amazon world, new concentrations of power are bringing forth new vulnerabilities and also new models of resistance. This week on the show, Kathy Albisa and Sabino Milian discuss the targeting of activists in immigration sweeps. Those ICE raids aren't that random, they say. Then, as Amazon gets even bigger, what happens to the workers behind your mouse click? The stores may be virtual, but the violence is not. We'll hear how low-wage warehouse workers are raising the floor in Chicago. It's all coming up on The Laura Flanders Show, the place where the people who say it can't be done take a back seat to the ones who are doing it. Welcome. With Trump's Muslim ban stymied for now in the courts, media coverage of the immigration issue is quieter. But raids by ICE, that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, are continuing, and not just on a random basis, say activists. In case after case, people are being targeted, not just because of their papers, but also, many think, because of their organizing. And ICE raids are becoming intimidation tactics, affecting not just workers, but the movements they're a part of. Kathy Albisa is the executive director of National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, a nonprofit working with many of these workers, and Sabino Milian is a member of Brand Workers, a nonprofit organization bringing local food production workers together for good jobs and a sustainable food system for all of us. Thank you both for coming in. Glad to have you. So let's start, Kathy, with what you're seeing. What's happening out there?
Well, we've seen some troubling incidents, and we're trying to figure out what level of significance they have.
Like what?
There's a very high-profile taking into custody of Kiki Balcazar in Vermont. So Kike is a leader in the Milk with Dignity campaign, and he was taken into custody right after a meeting. Right? It did not feel random. And it's not the first time that migrant justice members have found themselves picked up as if somehow ICE knew exactly what their meeting schedules were.
Now, Milk with Dignity was one of the migrant worker-dominated organizations that worked in broad progressive coalitions in Vermont.
Yes, it's migrant justice, and their campaign is Milk with Dignity. And they are basically taking a page from the Coalition of Immokalee Worker playbook and trying to establish a worker-driven social responsibility program in Vermont dairy.
So they're having a meeting.
They're having a meeting, and as they walk out, there were ICE agents specifically to pick up the spokesperson for the campaign. Previously, people had been picked up after coming from a Jobs with Justice meeting right out of the airport. Very, very questionable experiences. We've also seen in other parts of the country workers getting picked up when they're going through basic processes to exercise their labor rights.
There was a story out of Massachusetts.
That's right. So lawyers in Massachusetts say this is unprecedented. A worker that was injured, entitled to workers' comp after working for many years in the state, shows up to settle a claim with his employer, who had not bought insurance and was out of compliance, and instead of his employer showing up, immigration agents are there.
So how do you explain that? What's your hypothesis of what's going on?
Well, formally, the federal government takes the position that they do not target people for deportations based on their political beliefs. And certainly, they would say that they don't target people because they exercise their basic rights. But whether or not, my feeling is whether or not it is a conscious and intentional choice, once ICE starts responding to abusive employers who are retaliating against workers for exercising their basic rights or for expressing their political beliefs or for addressing conditions that are frankly subhuman in much of our low-wage worker force, they have become an agent of abusive employers and not a representative of the people of this country.
And not just abusive employers, but those who would seek to intimidate movements. Because what you've described, and I've heard from other sources, is the impact goes well beyond that one person who's targeted in the raid.
Absolutely. In Vermont, it's really chilled a number of efforts to push out the Milk with Dignity campaign. Workers with families, workers with children, they need to be concerned. It's not easy to take that kind of risk. Kike is still all over the country speaking. But that's quite a decision to make, knowing that you are being watched by ICE.
Kathy, Introduce us to Sabino a little bit. Tell our audience a little bit about the fight and the victory that's represented right here.
Yeah, well, Sabino, he was explaining to me that they received summary notice, present your paper in 10 days or you're out. You can imagine there was very little to do from a legal perspective. So he was telling me they organized. They were supported by brand workers, they were organized by brand workers, they had allies, they had the community, and shockingly, the company backed off. ¿Y qué pasó después que la compañía no te lo pidieron los papeles después?
No.
No, they simply ceded and no longer asked for those papers.
So turning to Sabina, what are you witnessing, what are you observing in the brand workers' work that you do in this context?
I've seen that brand workers is an organization that fights for workers' rights. It's affected us a lot because we're living with fear. We don't know if they'll show up to our places of work, pick us up. We don't know if we'll be coming home. You just don't know if while we're organizing, if ICE will show up or we'll get rounded up.
Clearly is a big challenge.
Mm-hmm.
How do you and the folks at Nestle work with organizations like Sabino's to fight back or respond in this kind of context?
Yeah, I think that at a moment like this, what was really extraordinary was the groundswell of support for Quique and for Zuli when they were taken. It was clearly recognized that this was not just a random deportation. There were thousands of people who responded, and there were, I think, 1,000 people outside their hearing. It's a moment where solidarity is called for, because that is the only way these abusive agencies under this administration are going to back down even an inch, right? Initially, they didn't even want to give Zuli bail. She has no record. There's nothing to indicate that she should be kept, but somehow they were withholding bail from her. But it was really the solidarity, the ability of movements to come together, the immigration movement, the workers' rights movement, the human rights movement in general, along with allies, right? This is a moment the allies really need to step up when communities are so vulnerable and their voices are being silenced.
While the Trump administration says immigration sweeps aren't politically targeted, our guest, Kathy Albisa, the executive director of the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, has a whole lot of reasons to suspect otherwise. Albisa works with many who've been subject to ICE raids, including our guest Sabino Milian, who's an organizer for a nonprofit that's recovered close to $1 million in unpaid wages and compensation for food, retail, and production workers. Sometimes, she says, it's the employers who have cause to call in the immigration enforcers. I'm Laura Flanders. This is The Laura Flanders Show. Much more to come. That's Injusticia by El Jury from her album La Lucha. Like the music on the show? Prefer it to, say, advertising? Become a sustaining member of the Laura Flanders Show today for as little as $2 a month and keep this podcast music-rich and commercial-free. Do your bit now by going to lauraflanders.com where you can subscribe or make a one-time donation. Thanks. Coming up, Sophia Zaman, an organizer for the Raise the Floor Alliance in Illinois. It's bringing together more than a dozen organizations all across Chicago to forge a new model of inside and outside the workplace resistance in defense of warehouse workers. But first, more from Kathy Albisa, Executive Director of the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, or NESRI, and Sabino Milian of Brand Workers on organizing in an ice age. It's hard to create a healthy farm-to-table food chain when activist workers fear being targeted by immigration and customs enforcement. What is the alternative model? I mean, what are some of the stories you're hearing where the organizing you're describing is scoring some victories even in this climate? I mean, Brand Workers is one. Your organization managed to score some victories even in this climate. How?
We've had victories because we've organized. Thanks to the organization that supported us at every moment.
What happened? What did you have to organize about? What was the problem?
At work, they gave us the letter giving us 10 days to provide paperwork affirming our legal status, or else we'd be fired. So we reached out to Brand Workers, and we got organized. And we protested in front of the bakery.
So, I mean, this is a great example of you can make progress even in these times. But I'm struck by the fact that most of the stories that I'm hearing of progress and innovative organizing are coming, as Sabino said, from fairly small organizations, grassroots groups, communities in organization, not so much from big labor. What's going on?
Big labor is definitely under attack, right, and has been for many years, and you can only imagine that it's intensifying. And it certainly doesn't help grow big labor that so much of our workforce is almost impossible to organize and unionize through formal channels. So the worker center movement has stepped in to fill that void, right, to work side by side with big labor and shift the landscape. And what I think happens with the worker center movement is you basically have a group of workers who are the most marginalized workers in this country. I'll give you some examples. In Vermont, just a little example, in Vermont, it's not unusual for a worker not to have an 8-hour break in a 24-hour period. So you'll have to sleep in 3-hour chunks. These things are standard in the business. So workers are willing to step up because they have at this point so little to lose. For example, we were speaking to workers in Chicago and workers organizing in the temp sector in different parts of the country. And when the administration came into power, we said, what are you concerned about? What additional types of repression do you fear might come down the pike? And the answer was devastating. They said, you know what, we don't even know what they could throw at us next. They've thrown everything at us. And this was even before Trump came into power. We started saying, well, what about deportations and raids? And said, well, we're already suffering that. What about retaliation? Well, we're already suffering that. What about, everything from stolen wages to violence to sexual harassment. So this group of workers has every reason to want to stand up and push back as hard as possible. And it is a very multicultural movement, so we're bringing organizing strategies from all over the world.
So that's the last part I wanted to ask you about, and that is the global nature of this. I mean, where do the workers that are Brand Worker members come from in terms of the world? Where are your members from?
Guatemala, Salvador, Honduras, lots of countries.
What lessons do you draw from that? Because the lesson being drawn by the Trump administration is build walls, keep people out. And a lot of people, even within the labor movement, are thinking that's the way to go. We need to keep our workers legal, secure, build walls around our workplaces.
Our board chair at NESRI is a wonderful scholar. He's a labor economist. And when we were talking about this, he said, Kathy, it's a paradox, but believe it or not, the fewer restrictions you have on workers being able to go where they need to go, the more protection all workers will have. And I said, Patrick, how could that be? And he said, because capital can travel freely wherever it wants. Goods travel more freely than people. The only ones suffering restrictions are workers. So what happens is capital follows the most abusive working conditions to exploit workers. If workers had the freedom to leave those places, capital would lose that leverage. That's his perspective. And speaking to a lot of progressive economists, they actually talk about a very open immigration policy ultimately being the better longer-term strategy to bring labor standards up here and around the world. It is a global problem. We cannot solve it by being made in the USA. We need to solve it with a global solution.
And in the short term?
In the short term, as I said, at this moment in time is a moment for real solidarity and weaving together our movements. It's a moment where the immigration issues, the workers' rights issues, the gender issues, the race issues have come together in a particular toxic brew. The strange, maybe, opportunity that brings up is that it brings us all closer together to respond. As I said, the solidarity with migrant justice, and these are workers that 15 years ago you wouldn't have seen in Vermont. As you said, the world has changed, has been beautiful. Beautiful is just the only word that comes to mind. The outpouring of love and support is, I think, the beginning of changing this sort of supremacist, toxic environment that this administration is moving forward.
Beautiful. Kathy, Sabino, thank you so much.
Kathy Albisa of the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative and Sabino Milian of Brand Workers have been talking about how ICE raids are affecting immigrant organizers. A healthy food system needs workers who aren't fearful of speaking up. For more information on what you can do and to watch additional video related to this week's interviews, go to lauraflanders.com. We'll be right back with our next guest, Sophia Zaman. She's working with warehouse workers in Chicago, the ones who fulfill your online shopping orders. The stores may be virtual, but the violence isn't, they say. That's coming up after this musical break, featuring Indiferencia by El Jury. I'm Laura Flanders. This is The Laura Flanders Show. Thanks for listening.
Siempre puede amarte hasta morir. Triste, sola en el mundo, huérfana de amor, anhelo un querer, doy mi corazón, triste padecer. Quiero que tú sepas, alma mía, la tristeza que me embarga, tu desprecio me atormentas, la cruel indiferencia de un mal amor.
It's not just ICE raids. A new report exposes how companies breed fear among low-wage workers through illegal retaliation against those who try to stand up for their rights. In Illinois, it wasn't big labor, but an alliance of community-based workers groups who compiled a report. In Chicago, I had a chance to hear more from Sophia Zaman, alliance organizer.
Raise the Floor is, I would call it, right, the next step in the worker center movement. And so worker centers have been around for about the past decade, and they sort of emerged to respond to the changing nature of our economy, in which, multinational corporations are moving freely across borders. Jobs are getting outsourced across seas, and the work here that's available is low-wage, low-quality positions. And the people who usually occupy those jobs are immigrants, people of color, and other communities of color. And unfortunately, those folks, those communities have always been on the margins of sort of strong unions core. And I say that as someone as a former union organizer with a lot of love. But there's just sort of cultural nuances and cultural barriers, right, to participating in traditional labor movements. And so worker centers emerged to respond to this crisis of our economy and a crisis of the labor movement. And so in Chicago, there are 8 worker centers that are organizing across various low-wage industries, anything from restaurant and retail to warehousing and manufacturing, domestic work and cleaning, day labor, and formerly incarcerated workers who are experiencing their own barriers. And Raise the Floor's purpose was sort of to unite these 8 worker centers around shared issues that all low-wage workers are experiencing, issues of wage wage theft or discrimination or unsafe working conditions and retaliation. In Chicago, we have a thriving worker center movement. There are actually 8 worker centers that span across geography and industry. So some worker centers are organizing by neighborhood, like Southeast Chicago, where there aren't a lot of resources. Some worker centers are organizing by identity, like the Worker Center for Racial Justice, which is organizing returning citizens, formerly incarcerated workers. And some worker centers are organized by industry, like the Chicago Workers Collaborative, that's organizing in the temp staffing industry, or the Warehouse Workers for Justice, or ROC Chicago, Restaurant Opportunity Center. And what's so unique about Raise the Floor is that this is the first time that worker centers have come together in this kind of, not just coalition, but alliance. Chicago is so important to the economy because it's actually the logistics hub of the country. So while most products may be made in China, for example, they have to go through either the Port of Los Angeles or the Port of Oakland and then get on a train. And the only way to get to the East Coast is you have to go through Chicago, because Chicago is where all the railroad tracks converge. And so in fact, Chicago has a booming logistics industry that requires factory jobs and manufacturing jobs to meet this demand. Companies like Target, Walmart, Amazon, the companies that you use every day with a booming digital economy that you can get your goods in 2 days, the 2-day shipping comes in at an expense, and it's usually at the expense of a worker. Any kind of abuse you can think of, we captured it in our report. One story that really struck me is Victoria, right? She works at a pizza factory in Romeoville, Illinois, right? Interesting location, a lot of warehousing and logistics industry, big boom there. And Victoria was working at this frozen pizza factory, putting ingredients onto the pizzas and then building the boxes. And this is a pretty standard job in the Chicago area, manufacturing job, factory job. And the motion of putting the boxes together and the motion of putting the ingredients on the pizzas, right? You're just doing the same repetitive motions all day. And so naturally, your wrists would start to deteriorate. This is just, it comes with the work, right? And so Victoria went to the doctor because she was experiencing pain, and the doctor said, well, you can no longer do this kind of work, otherwise you'll have permanent damage to your wrists. So Victoria went to her floor manager, and she shared this information, went to the doctor's note and said, I'm experiencing pain, I need different work. And so the boss called her worthless. The boss said, you are disposable. We're going to put you in isolation because you can't do the work that we need, so whatever, like go. And they put her in isolation in the frozen section, and they didn't warn her. She didn't even have warm clothes, and so she was put in isolation because she complained. And then when she complained about the isolation, she was fired, right? So you see this sort of escalation from being called worthless, that your opinions don't matter, that your labor is invaluable, to being put in isolation so you can't organize with your coworkers, to straight up being fired. These practices aren't legal, and there are laws on the books that demonstrate such, but and worker centers have been part of the front lines to win a lot of these policy changes, but ultimately if workers can't claim those rights, if they can't stand up for their rights, then it just becomes a piece of paper and of no use to the lived experiences they have on the ground. So there's a current organizing campaign happening at a factory called IFCO that is a distributor for Walmart, and they produce pallets that ship the groceries from the factory to the grocery store. And these factories are, unfortunately, it's just one story of hundreds, but the conditions are terrible, right? Workers are packing these pallets, standing up to their ankles in feces because the sewers have overflown. They don't have access to training or health and safety equipment, and so they are operating chemicals and inhaling them unsafely. And they are operating machinery that's they're being asked to shove their hands into machinery that's still moving, that has the potential to chop off their arm, but you got to get that 2-day shipping, and so you got to move as fast as you can. The nature of the industry is that in order to compete, you have to break the law, right? You have to build wage theft into your business model. You have to build in unsafe working conditions into the business model to stay competitive. And so the way to keep competitive and the way to break the law is to develop a culture of fear so that workers can't come forward or don't feel comfortable coming forward to stand up for their rights. And so we see it every day. It's the biggest barrier to organizing and it's the biggest barrier for workers to stand up for their rights. So for us, until we address workplace retaliation, we can't fully impact any other issue area. So in this particular moment where we see that union density is on the decline and that this culture of fear is just permeating every workplace, we need an organization that can hold space for the trauma that workers are experiencing. We need organizations to have the kind of slack that's required to test new membership models, to test new organizing campaigns. The exciting thing about Raise the Floor is that it sort of gives that added capacity so that worker center organizers can focus on what they do best, which is organizing, so that they have access to any components that you would need for any strong campaign, like a research shop that demonstrates why we need change, like a communication shop that centers the voices of workers and elevates their stories in the media. Like a policy shop that can have a presence at the Capitol and can make sure that workers are being centered in all of our discussions about policy change. I think that worker centers alone cannot meet the scale of abuse that we know exists in these kinds of industries, but we need government agencies to formalize these relationships and fundamentally recognize that in a complaint-driven model, you need community partners and you need workers. At the Worker Center movement, we fundamentally believe that workers are the experts of their own lives and they should be the ones driving the policy solutions that they need. And so we believe that any enforcement change, any policy change needs to center their voices, their experiences. And in addition to that, we sort of see 3 key ingredients, the first of which, of course, is workers and the tacit knowledge they carry of their workplaces and industries. But the second is community partnerships, that worker centers in particular are trusted community organizations that are in the community, they share language, they share cultural nuances, and they build deep, deep trust, the kind of trust you can't get by just telling a worker, go show up at this government building downtown, take a train, show ID at the front door. That's not a very trusting environment. You need an organizer with you who will make you understand of your own sense of your own power, that you are the expert of your own life and you know what you need and you know that this practice is illegal, right? And so it's up to you to stand up for those rights and feel confident that you know what justice looks like and you're going to achieve it. As worker centers, we engage individuals in their role as workers, but we fully recognize them as whole human beings that are part of particular neighborhoods or part of particular racial ethnic groups and part of particular religious institutions. And we aren't just fighting to improve the material conditions. So that's certainly important to us, but ultimately organizing is about altering the relations of power. It's about helping our communities understand that we are the source of everything we need. And we dream of a democratic, joyful, beautiful workplace in which workers have dignity and respect and that they are the ones who are centered in our work and not profits.
We've been listening to a report from Sophia Zaman about the Raise the Floor Alliance, an initiative that's pulling people together from all across Chicago to stand up for workers abused in online retailer warehouses like Amazon's. Thanks for listening. You can watch these interviews, see video exclusives, and find years of our archives at lauraflanders.com. Check it out. Like what you're hearing and what you're not hearing, like advertising? Put your money where your media is by supporting ad-free, independent podcasts like this one. Go to lauraflanders.com/membership and help us spread the word. We don't have lobbyists or lots of money for PR, but we have you. Share with your friends. Write us a review on iTunes or wherever it is you get your podcasts and spread the word. Thanks. These interviews are produced by yours truly, Laura Flanders, and supervising producer Anna Barsan, with Monica Mohapatra, Natasha Elena Ullman, Jeannie Hopper, Danica D'Souza, Emily Allen, Charlotte Prager, and Diego Romero Montel. Write to me, tell me what you think. That's Laura, Laura, at lauraflanders.com. I'm pretty good at getting back to you. The Laura Flanders Show is a collaborative effort. It is made possible by the Novo Foundation and listeners like you. We can't do it without you. Contribute at lauraflanders.com. Meanwhile, stay kind, stay curious. I'm Laura Flanders.